the wagon wheel. Truck Stop sat at the intersection of two highways in the flatlands of eastern New Mexico, a low-slung building with a gravel lot and a sign that hadn't been updated since 1987. It served truckers heading west toward Arizona and travelers who'd taken a wrong turn and needed directions back to the interstate. The coffee was strong, the portions were large, and the staff had learned to handle just about anything that walked through the door. Jolene Pickett had worked there for 6 years, ever since she'd moved back to Clayton after her marriage fell apart, and left her with nothing but a suitcase and a daughter who needed stability more than she needed explanations. She was 34 years old, with calloused hands and a smile she'd learned to fake so well it sometimes fooled even her. The tips weren't great, but they were steady, and steady was what mattered when you were raising a child alone, in a town that offered few options and even fewer second chances. It was a Thursday night in early March, the kind of night when the wind came howling down from the mountains and made the windows rattle in their frames. The dinner rush had come and gone, leaving behind a scattering of regulars. 2 old-timers nursing decaf in the corner booth, a young couple sharing a plate of fries, and a table of 10 men in leather vests who'd pulled in an hour ago on motorcycles that gleamed like they'd been polished that morning. Jolene had served the bikers without hesitation. She'd been doing this job long enough to know that appearances meant nothing. Some of the roughest-looking customers tipped the best, and some of the clean-cut businessmen were the ones who made comments about her body when they thought no one was listening. The bikers had been polite, almost formal. They'd ordered burgers and coffee and pie, said please and thank you, and kept their voices low enough that she had to lean in to hear their orders. She'd noticed the patches on their vests, Hell's Angels. The name carried weight, even out here in the middle of nowhere. But weight didn't always mean trouble, and these men hadn't given her any reason to worry. The truck driver came in at 9:15. He was big, not tall, but wide, with a gut that strained against his flannel shirt and arms that suggested he'd been strong once before the muscle turned to something softer. His face was red from wind or drink or both, and he walked with the swagger of a man who expected the world to get out of his way. He took a seat at the counter, 3 stools down from the register, and slapped his palm against the surface hard enough to make the salt shakers jump. "Service," he called out. "Sometime tonight would be nice." Jolene was already walking toward him, her order pad in hand, her smile firmly in place. "Evening. What can I get you?" He looked her up and down, slowly, deliberately, the kind of look that cataloged everything and respected nothing. "Well, aren't you a pretty little thing?" His voice was loud enough to carry. "They grow 'em nice out here in the desert." Jolene's smile didn't waver. She'd heard worse. She'd heard much worse. "Coffee to start?" "Sure, sweetheart. Coffee, black like my soul." He laughed at his own joke, a wet, barking sound. "And keep it coming. I've got a long night ahead." She poured his coffee and set it in front of him, careful to stay out of arm's reach. She'd learned that trick early, never get close enough for them to grab. "You want to see a menu?" "I want to see you bend over and get me one." He grinned, showing teeth that were yellow at the edges. Slowly, Jolene felt the familiar flush of anger and shame that came with moments like this. The heat in her cheeks, the tightness in her chest. She wanted to throw the coffee in his face. She wanted to tell him exactly what she thought of men who treated women like objects to be commented on and cataloged. But she had a daughter at home and rent to pay, and a manager who'd made it clear that customer complaints were taken seriously, even when the customers were the problem. "Menus are right there," she said, nodding toward the stack at the end of the counter. "I'll give you a minute to decide." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her back straight, her hands steady. Behind her, she heard him laugh again. "Playing hard to get. I like that." In the corner booth, one of the bikers looked up from his coffee. His name was Sam Garrett, though most people called him Preacher, for reasons he didn't talk about anymore. He was 58 years old, with a white beard and pale blue eyes that had seen enough of the world to know when something was wrong. He'd been watching the truck driver since he walked in, the way he moved, the way he looked at the waitress, the way he took up space like he owned it. "We got a problem?" asked the man across from him. His name was Danny Voss, younger by a decade, with a shaved head and tattoos that crawled up his neck like ivy. "Maybe." Preacher kept his voice low. "Keep an eye on it." The other bikers had noticed too. Conversations had quieted. Eyes had shifted. The table of 10 men in leather vests had become something more alert, more focused, without anyone saying a word. Jolene returned to the counter with a fresh pot of coffee. The truck driver had opened a menu, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think you're wasted in a place like this. Pretty girl like you should be somewhere nicer, somewhere people appreciate what they're looking at." "I appreciate a good tip," Jolene said. Her voice was flat. "You ready to order?" "I'm ready for a lot of things." He reached out and caught her wrist as she moved to refill his cup. His grip was tight, tighter than it needed to be. "What time do you get off, sweetheart? Maybe we could let go of me." Her voice was quiet, controlled, but there was steel underneath it. "Ah, come on. I'm just being friendly." "Let go." He didn't. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the diner like a blade. Preacher was standing, his full height unfolding slowly, his pale eyes fixed on the man at the counter. Behind him, 9 other bikers rose in sequence, a wave of leather and denim and silent intent. The truck driver's grip loosened. He turned on his stool, his face shifting from annoyance to something else as he took in what was walking toward him. "There a problem here?" Preacher asked. His voice was calm, almost gentle, the voice of a man who didn't need to raise it to be heard. The truck driver let go of Jolene's wrist. "No problem, just talking." Didn't look like talking. Preacher stopped 3 feet away, close enough to matter, far enough to give the man a choice. "Looked like you had your hands on a woman who asked you to let go. I heard what you were just." Preacher's eyes never left the truck driver's face. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay for your coffee. You're going to leave a generous tip. And you're going to walk out that door and get in your truck and drive away. You're not going to say another word to this woman. You're not going to look at her. You're not going to come back to this establishment. Do you understand?" The truck driver's face had gone from red to pale. He looked past Preacher to the 9 men standing behind him, their arms folded, their expressions unreadable. "You can't." "I can." Preacher leaned in, just slightly, "and I will. So the question is, do you want to find out what happens next, or do you want to be smart?" The silence stretched. The old-timers in the corner were frozen, their decaf forgotten. The young couple had stopped eating, their eyes wide. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, the cook peering through the service window with a spatula still in his hand. The truck driver reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled 20. He set it on the counter, his hand shaking slightly, and stood up from the stool. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Yeah, it is." Preacher stepped aside, creating a clear path to the door. "Have a safe drive." The truck driver walked out. He didn't look back. A moment later, the sound of an engine starting cut through the night, followed by the crunch of gravel as the truck pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the highway. Preacher turned to Jolene. "You okay?" She was still holding the coffee pot, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere to go. Yeah, I'm okay." "You sure?" "Yeah." She set down the pot and pressed her palms flat against the counter, steadying herself. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, we did." Preacher's voice was quiet but certain. "No one should have to put up with that. Not here, not anywhere." He turned and walked back to his table, where the other bikers were already settling back into their seats, the tension draining out of the room like water from a broken dam. The old-timers picked up their coffee cups. The young couple resumed their fries. The cook disappeared back into the kitchen, and the clatter of dishes resumed. Jolene stood at the counter for a long moment, looking at the $20 bill the truck driver had left behind. Then she looked at the table of bikers, the men who'd stood up without being asked, who'd put themselves between her and a stranger's cruelty, simply because it was the right thing to do. She picked up the coffee pot and walked over to their table. "Refills are on me," she said, "for as long as you want to stay." Preacher looked up at her, and for the first time that night he smiled. "We might take you up on that." The bikers stayed until closing. They ordered more coffee, more pie, talked quietly among themselves while Jolene finished her shift. She found herself glancing at their table more often than she needed to, reassured by their presence in a way she hadn't expected. The truck driver's grip still echoed on her wrist, a phantom pressure she couldn't quite shake. At 11 o'clock, she cashed out the register and hung up her apron. The cook, a quiet man named Eddie who'd worked at the wagon wheel longer than anyone, caught her eye as she headed for the back. "You okay, Joe?" "I'm fine." She said it automatically, the way she said everything that wasn't true. "Thanks, Eddie." "Those guys," he nodded toward the bikers, "they're good people. I've seen their type before. They look rough, but they show up when it matters." Jolene didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and pushed through the door into the back hallway. Her locker was there, a dented metal box that held her purse and her jacket, and a photo of her daughter, Lily, taped to the inside of the door. Lily was 7 years old with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn chin. She was staying with Jolene's neighbor tonight, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Campos, who watched her on the nights Jolene worked late. She grabbed her things and stepped out the back door into the parking lot. The wind had died down, leaving behind a cold stillness that made her breath fog in the air. Her car was parked at the far end of the lot, a 12-year-old Honda that needed new brakes and probably a new transmission, but kept running through sheer stubbornness. She was halfway across the gravel when she saw the truck. It was parked on the access road that ran behind the truck stop, its headlights off, its engine idling. She couldn't see the driver, but she didn't need to. She knew. The shape of the cab, the angle of the mirrors, it was the same truck that had pulled out hours ago. He'd come back. Jolene's heart slammed against her ribs. She stopped walking, her keys clutched in her fist, calculating the distance to her car, to the back door, to anywhere that wasn't here. The truck sat there like a predator waiting in tall grass, patient and certain. "Need a hand?" The voice came from behind her, and she spun around, her keys raised like a weapon. Preacher stood a few feet away, his hands in his jacket pockets, his pale eyes reflecting the light from the truck stop's sign. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to startle you." She lowered her keys, her breath coming fast. "There's a truck on the access road. I think it's him." Preacher looked past her, his expression shifting from calm to something harder. "Stay here." He walked toward the access road, not hurrying, but not hesitating either. The gravel crunched under his boots, the only sound in the stillness. Jolene watched him go, her heart still pounding, her mind racing through possibilities she didn't want to imagine. The truck's engine revved. Headlights flared to life, cutting through the darkness like accusations. For a moment, the vehicle didn't move, just sat there, its lights pointed at Preacher, who stood in the middle of the access road with his arms folded across his chest. Then, slowly, the truck backed up. It turned onto the highway and drove away, its taillights shrinking into red pinpricks before disappearing entirely. Preacher walked back to Jolene. "He's gone. For now." Her voice was shaking. She hated that it was shaking. "He knows where I work. He knows what time I get off. What if he comes back tomorrow? What if—" "Hey." Preacher's voice was gentle, the kind of gentle that came from practice. "One thing at a time. Right now you need to get home. Where do you live?" "About 10 minutes from here, on Miller Road." "We'll follow you. Make sure you get there safe. You don't have to." "I know we don't have to." He met her eyes, and something in his gaze made her stop arguing. "That's not why we're doing it." The ride home felt longer than 10 minutes. Jolene kept checking her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck's headlights bearing down on her. But all she saw were the motorcycles, 5 of them, riding in formation behind her, their engines a steady rumble that felt like a heartbeat. She pulled into the driveway of her small house, a rented 2-bedroom with a chain-link fence and a yard that needed mowing. The bikes pulled up to the curb, engines idling, and Preacher dismounted and walked to her car. "This is you?" "This is me." She got out, her purse clutched against her chest. "Thank you for everything." "You got someone inside? Someone who can stay with you tonight?" "My daughter. She's 7. Jolene glanced at the house where a light was on in the living room. "My neighbor's been watching her. She's probably asleep by now." Preacher nodded. He reached into his vest and pulled out a card, plain white, with a phone number handwritten in black ink. "This is my number," he said. "Anything happens, anything at all, you call. Day or night, doesn't matter." Jolene took the card. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with implications she couldn't fully grasp. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me." "I know enough." Preacher's voice was quiet. "I know you're working a job that doesn't pay enough, raising a kid on your own, and tonight some piece of garbage put his hands on you because he thought he could. I know the world's full of men like him, and it's short on people willing to stand up." He paused. "We're not heroes. We're just guys who decided a long time ago that some things aren't acceptable. This is one of them." He turned and walked back to his bike. The other riders were waiting, their faces shadowed beneath helmets and bandanas. Preacher mounted up, kicked the engine to life, and raised a hand in farewell. Jolene watched them ride away, the sound of their engines fading into the night. She stood in her driveway for a long moment, holding the card with the phone number, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety exactly. Safety was a luxury she'd stopped believing in years ago, but something close to it, something that felt like the beginning of hope. She went inside. Mrs. Campos was dozing on the couch, the television murmuring low. Lily was asleep in her bedroom, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, her breathing slow and peaceful. Jolene stood in the doorway and watched her daughter sleep, thinking about all the things she couldn't protect her from and all the things she would die trying to. The card was still in her hand. She looked at the number, memorizing it without meaning to, then slipped it into her pocket. Tomorrow she would go back to work. Tomorrow the truck driver might return, or he might not. Tomorrow the world would keep being the hard, unfair place it had always been. But tonight, someone had stood up for her. Tonight, she wasn't alone. That had to count for something. She checked the locks on every door and window, then sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She didn't drink, watching the road through the curtains until the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon. The truck never came. But Jolene stayed awake anyway, because hope was a fragile thing, and she'd learned the hard way that fragile things needed guarding. The truck driver's name was Earl Briggs. Jolene learned this 2 days later when Deputy Martinez showed up at the wagon wheel during her afternoon shift with a notepad and questions she didn't want to answer. "We got a complaint," Martinez said. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested he still believed in the system. "From a trucker passing through. Says he was threatened by a group of bikers at this establishment Thursday night. Says one of them got in his face, made him leave." Jolene set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. "Did he mention why the bikers got involved?" "He says there was a misunderstanding. Says he was just being friendly, and things got blown out of proportion." A misunderstanding. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. "He grabbed my wrist, Deputy. He wouldn't let go when I asked him to. He made comments about my body all night and followed me to the parking lot after my shift." Martinez's pen stopped moving. "He followed you." His truck was parked on the access road behind the building. Lights off, engine running, he was waiting for me. Jolene heard her voice rising and forced it back down. "Those bikers didn't threaten anyone. They stood up for me when no one else would. And if that's a crime, then I don't know what we're doing here." The deputy was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his notepad, then back at Jolene, and something shifted in his expression. "Did you want to file a report about what he did to you? Would it matter?" "It might." Jolene thought about it. She thought about the hours she'd spend at the sheriff's office, the questions she'd have to answer, the way her words would be weighed against his. She thought about Earl Briggs out there on the highway, moving from truck stop to truck stop, doing to other women what he'd tried to do to her. "Yeah," she said. "I want to file a report." Martinez took her statement. He was thorough, professional, and when he left, he gave her a card with a case number and told her someone would be in touch. Jolene didn't expect anything to come of it. She'd been through enough to know that the system protected people like Earl Briggs more often than it protected people like her, but she filed the report anyway, because not filing it felt like giving up, and she wasn't ready to give up yet. That evening, she called the number on Preacher's card. He answered on the second ring. "This is Sam. It's Jolene from the wagon wheel." "I remember." His voice was warm, unhurried. "Everything okay?" She told him about Deputy Martinez, about the complaint Earl Briggs had filed, about the report she'd made in return. She told him she was scared. Scared that Briggs would come back, scared that the law wouldn't do anything, scared that she was putting her daughter at risk by not just keeping her head down and letting it go. Preacher listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence stretched for a moment before he spoke. "You did the right thing," he said, "filing that report. It might not feel like it matters, but it does. It creates a record. Next time he does this to someone, and there will be a next time, your report will be there. It'll show a pattern. What if there's a next time with me? That's what I wanted to talk to you about." She heard movement on his end of the line, the creak of a chair. "The club's been discussing your situation. We've got a few members who live in the area. Albuquerque, mostly, but some closer. We'd like to keep an eye on things for a while. Not in a way that disrupts your life, just presence. Making sure Briggs knows you're not alone." "You'd do that? For a stranger?" "You're not a stranger anymore, Jolene. You're someone who needed help and didn't get it from the people who should have provided it. That makes you our business." Jolene felt her throat tighten. She pressed the phone against her ear and stared out the window at the empty street, at the small yard where Lily played and the driveway where her old Honda sat waiting for the next repair it couldn't afford. "I don't know how to repay you," she said. "You don't repay kindness, you pass it on." Preacher's voice was matter of fact, like he was stating something obvious. "Someday, you'll see someone who needs help, and you'll remember this, and you'll do something. That's how it works." They talked for another 20 minutes. Preacher asked about Lily, about Jolene's life before Clayton, about the dreams she'd put aside when survival became more important than ambition. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, about her ex-husband, about the way he'd eroded her confidence so gradually she didn't notice until it was gone, about the years she'd spent rebuilding herself one shift at a time. "You're stronger than you think," Preacher said when she finished. "Most people would have broken by now. You're still standing." "Standing's all I know how to do." "That's more than enough." 2 days later, the first bike showed up. His name was Rico Sandoval, and he rode a Harley Sportster that had seen better decades. He was in his 40s, stocky and quiet, with a graying goatee and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He parked in the wagon wheel lot at the start of Jolene's shift and stayed until closing, drinking coffee and reading a paperback western he'd brought from home. "Just here if you need me," he said when she asked. "Pretend I'm part of the furniture." The next day, a different rider appeared, then another. They rotated through, never more than one or two at a time, always polite, always unobtrusive. They bought food they didn't need and left tips that made Jolene's eyes water when she counted them at the end of her shifts. They talked to the regulars, helped Eddie carry boxes from the storage room, fixed a leak in the bathroom that the owner had been ignoring for months. Word spread through Clayton the way it always did in small towns, slowly at first, then all at once. People started asking Jolene about the bikers, about what they were doing there, about the rumors that had begun to circulate. She told them the truth, or as much of it as she could without breaking down. "They're friends," she said. "They're looking out for me." Most people accepted that. A few didn't. Jolene heard whispers at the grocery store, saw looks at church. Some folks in Clayton didn't trust outsiders, especially outsiders who looked like the men from Hijos del Camino, but the whispers were quieter than Jolene had expected, and the looks faded faster. People could see what the bikers were doing. They could see that Jolene was safer with them than without them. And slowly, something began to change. Other women started talking to her. The night shift nurse at the clinic who'd been followed home by a patient, the teenager at the gas station who'd been cornered by a group of boys from the high school, the elderly widow whose landlord had been making threats. They came to Jolene with their stories, hesitant and ashamed, as if speaking the words aloud might make them true in a way they hadn't been before. Jolene listened. She gave them Preacher's number. She told them what he'd told her. "You're not alone, you're not crazy, and you don't have to put up with this." She didn't know if any of them called, but she knew they had the option now, and options mattered. Options were the difference between drowning and swimming. 3 weeks after the incident at the wagon wheel, Deputy Martinez called. Earl Briggs had been arrested in Arizona. A waitress at a truck stop outside Flagstaff had fought back when he grabbed her, and this time there were witnesses who were willing to testify. The prosecutor was building a case, and Jolene's report was part of it. "It mattered," Martinez said. "What you did. I wanted you to know that." Jolene hung up the phone and sat at her kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing. She thought about the night in the diner, about Preacher standing up from his booth, about the silence that had followed. She thought about all the women Earl Briggs had hurt before her, and all the women he might have hurt after, if someone hadn't finally stopped him. She thought about the card in her pocket, worn soft from handling, and the number she'd memorized without meaning to. Then she picked up the phone and called Preacher to tell him the news. "Good," he said when she finished. "That's good. It's because of you. All of you. It's because you were brave enough to speak up. We just made sure you had the chance." Jolene closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest felt lighter. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "You're welcome." She could hear the smile in his voice. "Now get some rest. You've earned it." She did. That night, for the first time since March, Jolene Pickett slept through until morning. Spring came to Clayton in a rush of wildflowers and longer days. The wind still blew down from the mountains, but it carried warmth now instead of bite, and the evenings stretched golden and slow. At the wagon wheel, business picked up the way it always did when the weather turned. More travelers, more truckers, more faces passing through, on their way to somewhere else. Jolene had stopped flinching every time the door opened. It had taken weeks, but the fear that had lived in her chest since that night in March had finally loosened its grip. She still checked the parking lot before leaving. She still kept Preacher's number in her pocket. But the vigilance had become routine rather than panic, a habit instead of a survival instinct. The bikers still came by, though less frequently now. Rico showed up every Tuesday, claiming the coffee at the wagon wheel was better than anywhere else in the state. Danny Voss passed through on his way to Albuquerque once a month, always stopping to check in, always leaving a tip that covered half Jolene's rent. Others rotated through, faces she recognized, names she'd learned, men who'd become something like family without anyone saying the word out loud. Lily had started calling them her uncles. The first time she'd said it, Jolene had almost corrected her. They're not family, they're just friends. But she'd stopped herself. Because what was family, really, except the people who showed up, the people who stayed? On a Saturday in late April, Preacher rode into Clayton. Jolene was working the morning shift when she heard the familiar rumble of his bike pulling into the lot. She looked up through the window and saw him dismount, his movement slower than she remembered, his white beard longer. He walked toward the diner with the unhurried gait of a man who had nowhere else to be. Sam. She met him at the door with a smile that came easier these days. It's been a while. Been busy. He took off his sunglasses and tucked them into his vest. Thought I'd check in, see how you're doing. I'm good. Really good, actually. She led him to the corner booth. His booth, she'd started thinking of it, and poured him a cup of coffee without asking. Lily's finishing first grade next month. She made the honor roll. Smart kid. She gets it from me. Jolene sat down across from him, something she'd never done during a shift before, but the morning was slow, and Eddie could handle the grill, and some conversations were more important than protocol. I never got to thank you properly, for everything you did. You thanked me plenty. I mean really thank you, not just words. She wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup, gathering her thoughts. When Earl Briggs grabbed my wrist that night, I thought, I don't know what I thought, that I'd have to just take it, the way I'd always taken it, that nobody would do anything because nobody ever did. She looked up at him. And then you stood up, all of you, like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Preacher's voice was quiet. It was the only thing. That's what I mean. For you, it was obvious. It was just what you do. But for me, she stopped, the words catching in her throat. For me, it changed everything. It made me remember that I was worth standing up for. I'd forgotten that, somewhere along the way. Preacher was silent for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the same way he'd done that first night, his pale eyes thoughtful. Can I tell you something? He asked. Of course. I wasn't always the man you see now. When I was younger, I did things I'm not proud of, hurt people who didn't deserve it, made choices that cost me everything, my family, my freedom, my sense of who I was. He paused. I spent 8 years in prison. When I got out, I didn't know how to be anything other than what I'd been. Angry, violent, looking for someone to blame for the mess I'd made of my life. Jolene listened without interrupting. She'd sensed there was a story behind the name Preacher, behind the quiet authority he carried, but she'd never asked. Some things you didn't ask. You waited until they were offered. I met a man in a diner, not so different from this one, Preacher continued. I was broke, hungry, looking for trouble. He was old, retired, just having his breakfast. I tried to rob him, pulled a knife, told him to give me his wallet. He shook his head slowly. You know what he did? He invited me to sit down, said he'd buy me breakfast if I put the knife away, said I looked like I needed a meal more than he needed his money. What did you do? I sat down. I don't know why. Something in his voice, maybe. The way he wasn't afraid of me, even though he should have been. Preacher's eyes were distant, lost in the memory. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his life, his wife who'd passed, his kids who didn't visit. He asked about mine, and when we were done, he gave me his card and told me if I ever wanted to be something different, I should call him. Did you? Took me 6 months, but yeah, I called. Preacher smiled, a small, private smile. He helped me find work, introduced me to people who gave me a chance even though I didn't deserve one. When I started writing with the club, he's the one who vouched for me. Said I had good in me that just needed a reason to come out. What happened to him? He passed about 10 years ago. Cancer. Preacher looked up at Jolene. But before he died, he made me promise something. He said, the only way to repay a kindness is to pass it on. that every person you help is a debt you're paying to someone else, someone who helped you when you didn't deserve it. Jolene felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back, her hands tight around her coffee cup. "That's why you do this," she said. "The club. Looking out for people. That's why I do this." Preacher nodded. "And that's why, someday, you'll do it too. Not the same way, maybe, but you'll see someone who needs help, someone the world's forgotten about, and you'll remember what it felt like to be standing in that parking lot alone, and you won't let them stay alone." The door chimed, and a family walked in. Parents and 2 kids, road-weary and hungry. Jolene wiped her eyes quickly and stood up. "I should get back to work." "You should." Preacher reached into his vest and pulled out an envelope. "Before you go, this is for you, from the club." Jolene took the envelope, frowning. "What is it?" "Open it later, when you've got time to think." She tucked it into her apron pocket and went back to work, seating the family, taking their orders, falling into the rhythm of the job she'd done for 6 years. But the envelope felt heavy against her hip, a weight she couldn't ignore. At the end of her shift, she sat in her car in the parking lot and opened it. Inside was a cashier's check for $15,000 and a note, handwritten on plain white paper, "For Lily's future, for yours. You've earned this. The Angels." Jolene stared at the check for a long time. $15,000, more money than she'd ever held in her hands, enough for Lily's college fund, or a down payment on a house, or 1,000 small things that had always felt out of reach. She thought about calling Preacher, about telling him she couldn't accept it, that it was too much, that she hadn't done anything to deserve this. But she remembered what he'd said. "You don't repay kindness. You pass it on." She folded the check carefully and put it in her wallet. Then she started the car and drove home, where Lily was waiting with a drawing she'd made at school and a story about the butterfly she'd seen at recess. That night, after Lily was asleep, Jolene sat on the porch and looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over her that night in March, when she'd stood in her driveway and wondered if hope was just another word for disappointment waiting to happen. She didn't wonder anymore. She knew. Hope was real. Kindness was real. And somewhere out there, on highways and back roads and in diners, just like the wagon wheel, there were people who showed up for strangers because it was the right thing to do. Jolene made a promise to herself. There on the porch, under the New Mexico sky, she would be one of those people. Not someday, now. It was time to pass it on. 2 years later, Jolene Pickett owned the wagon wheel. It hadn't been the plan. The plan had been to save the money, to put it toward Lily's college fund the way the note had suggested, to let it grow quietly while she kept working her shifts and counting her tips. But then, old Mr. Hendricks, who'd owned the truck stop since before Jolene was born, had a stroke. His kids lived in California and didn't want anything to do with a rundown diner in the middle of nowhere. They put it up for sale, priced to move, and Jolene had looked at the number and realized that between the check from the Angels and 3 years of careful saving, she could make it work. She'd called Preacher before she signed the papers. "Is this crazy?" she'd asked. "Taking on a business with Lily still in school, with everything that could go wrong?" "Probably," he'd said, "but crazy's not the same as wrong. You've been running that place for years, even if nobody gave you the title. Now you'll just have the paperwork to match." So she'd signed, and the wagon wheel became hers. The first thing she did was fix the sign. The second thing was to hire 2 more waitresses, young women from Clayton who needed jobs the way she'd once needed a job, who needed someone to give them a chance. She paid them fairly, built their schedules around their lives, and never once made them feel like they owed her anything except their best work. The third thing she did was put up a small plaque near the register. It was brass, simple, with words she'd chosen carefully. "This is a safe place. If you need help, ask." Not everyone understood what it meant, but the people who needed to understand understood. Over the months that followed, women came to her, travelers passing through, locals who'd heard rumors, strangers who'd seen the plaque and felt something shift in their chests. They came with stories of husbands who hit, boyfriends who controlled, strangers who followed. They came looking for a phone to use, a place to hide, a moment to breathe. Jolene helped them all. She kept a list of resources behind the counter, shelters, hotlines, lawyers who worked pro bono. She let women use the back office to make calls, gave them meals they didn't have to pay for, and sometimes, when the situation was bad enough, she called the number she still kept in her pocket. The Angels came when she called, not every time. They had their own lives, their own rides, their own distances to cover. But when it mattered, when the danger was real and immediate, they showed up. A woman fleeing an abusive husband found herself escorted to Albuquerque by 4 bikers who made sure no one followed. A teenage girl who'd been trafficked from El Paso was delivered safely to a shelter in Santa Fe, her captors too afraid of the leather-clad men to pursue. A grandmother whose son had been threatening her for money woke up to find 6 motorcycles parked outside her house, their riders drinking coffee on her porch like they had all the time in the world. Word spread, the way word always spreads. The wagon wheel became known as something more than a truck stop. It became a waypoint, a lighthouse, a place where people in trouble could find their footing. Truckers who'd once made crude comments learned to keep their mouths shut. Locals who'd dismissed Jolene as just another single mom learned to see her differently. The diner thrived, not despite its reputation, but because of it, because people wanted to eat at a place that stood for something, even if they couldn't articulate what that something was. Lily grew up in the middle of it all. She did her homework in the back booth after school, helped bus tables on busy weekends, learned to pour coffee before she learned to drive. She knew about the angels, about the plaque, about the women who sometimes appeared in the back office with red eyes and trembling hands. She never asked too many questions. She just watched and listened and absorbed the lesson her mother was teaching without words. When Lily was 12, she asked if she could meet Preacher. "Why?" Jolene asked. "Because I want to thank him," Lily said, "for what he did for you, for us." So the next time Preacher rode through Clayton, Jolene introduced them. They sat in the corner booth, his booth still, and Lily asked him questions about motorcycles and the road and what it felt like to ride through a thunderstorm. Preacher answered them all, patient and unhurried, his pale eyes crinkling at the corners. At the end of the conversation, Lily said something that made Jolene's breath catch. "I'm going to be like you when I grow up," Lily told Preacher. "Not a biker, maybe, but someone who helps, someone who shows up." Preacher looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jolene, and something passed between them, a recognition, a gratitude, a shared understanding of how far they'd come from that night in March, when a truck driver had grabbed a waitress's wrist and the world had changed. "You already are," Preacher said to Lily. "You've got your mother's heart. That's all you need." The years kept passing, the way years do. Lily graduated high school as valedictorian, went to college in Albuquerque on a scholarship she'd earned herself, came home on weekends to help at the diner when she could. She studied social work, driven by reasons she didn't have to explain to anyone who'd grown up at the wagon wheel. Jolene's hair went gray at the temples. Her hands developed the ache that came from decades of carrying plates and pouring coffee. But she kept working, kept showing up, kept the plaque polished, and the resources updated, and the back office ready for whoever might need it next. Preacher came by less often as the years went on. His rides got shorter, his stops more frequent. The last time Jolene saw him, he was 71 years old, his white beard thinner, his movements careful in the way of someone who knew his body was winding down. "How are you, Sam?" she asked, sitting across from him in the corner booth. "Old," he said, and smiled, "but still riding, still showing up. That's what matters. That's all that matters." He looked around the diner, at the plaque by the register, at the waitresses Jolene had trained, at the customers who nodded at him with respect, even though they didn't know his name. "You built something good here, Jolene, something that'll last. I had help. We all have help. That's the point." He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "I'm proud of you. You know that, right? Every time I think about that night, that scared woman in the parking lot who didn't know if she'd make it home, and I see what you've become." He shook his head. "It's everything. It's the whole reason any of this matters." Jolene squeezed his hand. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "Thank you," she said, "for standing up. Thank you for letting me." He rode out of Clayton that afternoon, his engine rumbling down the highway toward the horizon. Jolene stood in the parking lot and watched until he disappeared, the way she'd watched that first night, except everything was different now. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. 3 months later, she got the call. Preacher had passed in his sleep at home in Albuquerque, surrounded by brothers who'd loved him. The funeral was small, private, but the ride that followed was not. 200 bikers escorted his. Ashes to a spot in the mountains he'd loved, and Jolene was there, riding in a car behind the procession, Lily beside her. At the memorial, she stood up and spoke. She told them about the night at the wagon wheel, about the man who'd stood up when no one else would, about the chain of kindness that had started with a stranger in a diner and now stretched across years and miles and lives she'd never know. "He told me once that you don't repay kindness," she said. "You pass it on. That's what he did. That's what we all have to do. Every time we stand up for someone, every time we show up when it's hard, we're adding a link to that chain. And as long as we keep adding links, it never breaks." She looked out at the sea of leather and denim, at the faces of men and women who'd dedicated their lives to the same principle. "So thank you, Sam, for the first link, for all the ones that followed." She wiped her eyes. "We'll take it from here." The engines roared to life, a thunder that echoed off the mountains and rolled across the valley like a promise. Jolene closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, carrying with it the memory of a man who'd changed her life by doing something simple. He'd stood up, and because of that, so would she. So would Lily. So would every person who walked through the doors of the wagon wheel and saw the plaque by the register and understood what it meant. This is a safe place. If you need help, ask. It was enough. It was everything. It was the whole point. The chain continued.